Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen. I'm really delighted to be here and to follow on Amory's fascinating presentation. I've been given 10 minutes, and it kind of reminds me of an old Monty Python skit back in the mid-1970s, when in 1975 there was a program where some contestants were asked to summarize Marcel Proust's Remembrance of Things Past in 1 minute flat. And by the time they got to talk about dipping the Madeleine in the tea, the bell rang and the program went off. So I'm going to keep my eye on the bell very carefully for this part of the presentation. And I'm going to talk about China. Now, China is something like a Rorschach test for everybody in the West, because China has been an obsession which reveals the human psyche. Why is that? I guess the isolation, the geographical and topographical isolation of the place from the rest of the world led to a different form of development. And as early as the Middle Ages, the legend of the Kingdom of Prester John, whereby China would come to the rescue of Christendom because they would outflank Islam, was developed as a theory. Now, what happens today? We've heard your greatest former president, President Carter, say that nothing in the world can be solved without the agreement of G2. That is to say, the biggest economy in the world and the second biggest economy in the world, which is likely in our lifetimes to become the biggest economy in the world. And by, I guess if you believe Goldman Sachs numbers, by 2018, on PPP terms, China will be the biggest economy in the world. In absolute terms, by 2025. What has China done in this recent period of development? Between 1980, 1 year after the Four Modernizations movement was launched by Deng Xiaoping, and 2010, in that 30-year period, China's GDP increased 40 times in one generation. The energy consumption increased only 5 times, which is a remarkable state of affairs, because the energy intensity went down in the most critical period of its development, from abject poverty to something resembling a middle-class way of life with a per capita GDP of about $8,500 per annum. Of course, there are variations. How was that done? That was done principally through two factors: policy and investment. Now, for all the criticisms of the China development model as being very investment heavy, light on domestic consumption, heavy on exports, the laying down of policy actually helped to reduce energy intensity. Where do we go from here? I think we start off with an existential crisis in China. Why do I say that? China faces an existential crisis because if you superimpose a map of China on a map of the lower 48 states, you get an almost exact confluence. The northeast province of Heilongjiang, which has a Siberian climate, is almost exactly where New England is. In the southeast, where I come from, Hong Kong, we're actually where Miami is located. In the west, Xinjiang is where Washington State and Oregon are located. There is a bit of a gap in the middle where Montana, the Dakotas are. There you get Inner Mongolia and Outer Mongolia. And Tibet is where you have Arizona. So in that geographical space, you have 4.5 times the population of the United States. But within that geographical space, you have only 1/6 of the arable land of the United States. China is a very poor country, no question about that. And for all the numbers on development, we're looking at a poor developing country. In terms of energy resources, China has 20% of the world's population, but 1/6 of the world's energy resources, and 1/3 of the world's oil and gas. Before 1993, which was, I suppose, 15 years after the launch of the fourth modernization movement, China was a net oil exporting country. After that, it tipped. It tipped to become an oil importing country. And it could not get much supply because the supplies were constrained by geopolitics. It could not get supplies from Saudi Arabia. It could not get supplies from the Middle East. It was restricted to fishing in troubled waters, places like Angola, for which it has been criticized. But there was no choice. There was no choice because there was no supply. Things are a little different now, a little different since 2007, the year when the United States import of oil and gas and use of fossil fuels peaked. Now it's somewhat different, but there's another piece of bad news. China has supposedly the third largest coal reserves in the world, and is without doubt the biggest coal consumer and the coal producer in the world. However, in 2009, it became a net coal importer, its main fossil fuel. So within a space of less than 20 years, it became both net oil importing and net coal importing. And it doesn't have the resources to protect its sea lanes. It doesn't have the equivalent of the Seventh Fleet. It doesn't have actually even a usable aircraft carrier. There are no flight-capable, carrier-capable aircraft on the Chinese aircraft carrier even today. It suffers from energy insecurity in an acute fashion, perhaps more so, arguably, than Japan and South Korea, which has almost zero natural resources and are completely reliant on imports from overseas. So with that situation facing China, what is it to do? China is ripe for the Green Revolution, as Amory has told us earlier this morning. There's no question about that tipping point that we've reached in China. Now, what is to be done? The Green Revolution cannot succeed without both domestic innovation as well as foreign technology transfer. And the policy drivers of this are within the control of G2. The G2 process is a geopolitical process which seeks to find common ground, and I think much improvements have been made to that particular dialogue. However, it's bedeviled by certain assumptions on the impediments, including IP protection. But it is interesting to note that in the first year, when I visited China in 1984, when the patent law was passed, there was a big debate as to whether IP protection was actually a moral process. We know today the debate, particularly in India, is that there should be compulsory licensing of green technology. China has never argued for that. China has never argued for that because both financing as well as domestic innovation has made a quantum leap. In the year 2010, there is more IP litigation in China than there was in the United States. And the litigation in China is Chinese companies against Chinese companies. China now is the number 3 in the world in terms of patent registration. The 12th five-year plan aims to increase patent examiners to 9,000 by 2015 and to register 3.3 patents per 10,000 population. We have an extraordinary state of flux in China today, which I think is ripe for exploitation in terms of a solid G2 process which goes way beyond the Sunny Lands dialogue, which took place 18 months ago between President Xi and President Obama. I'm anxious, actually, to engage in a process of pedagogy in the course of this morning with AREI. I believe Chip will moderate. And the Chinese pedagogy I would like to adopt is the notion of Pao Zhen Yin Yu, which means throw out a brick to attract a piece of jade. That's the Chinese Socratic method, because I know I'm sitting in a room of experts, and I'm anxious to learn from all of you. So I've been given the red card, and I know I have to stop, but I really look forward to an exchange with everyone in this room, because we live in one world, and the solutions are available. It's really a matter of political will, whether we want to seize the moment. Thank you very much.
But I really want to focus on what I consider to be the critical issue and perhaps the defining issue of everything that we're talking about here, and that is that China and the United States constitute fully half of the world's annual GDP. I believe the numbers are USA is 20 trillion annual and China is 10. And also, when you calculate all in and take into account that CO2 is in the atmosphere at least 100. So the US has the lion's share. We're not going to get away with China's burning more now. Maybe they are the last few years, but we have longer than anybody. And so let's call it 25% China, 25% US, and that constitutes 50% of the CO2. So unless and until the US and China create a green bridge to lead this revolution into clean technology, the rest of the world really isn't going to follow or be able to move forward. So can we just jump in right there?
Well, I think you may be assuming that climate protection is contrary to countries' economic interests, but it's actually not if they understand that saving fuel costs less than buying fuel. You don't actually need international treaties and agreements to mutually coerce countries into doing something that already makes money. And I think the reason a lot of the negotiators, probably all of them, don't understand this is the curious history of the climate debate, that early on there were some fake economic studies funded mainly by the coal industry in this country showing that climate protection would be costly. And unfortunately, our major environmental groups fell right into the trap and said, well, it won't cost as much as you say, it will cost more, but it's worth it. What they should have said is, no, you got the sign wrong. This is not costly, but profitable. And unfortunately, that debate having got off on the wrong foot, the negotiators consistently follow economic theory that says it must cost more or we would have done it already because everyone runs on markets and markets are perfect. Utterly ridiculous assumptions. Whereas what they should be looking at is empirical engineering measurement and business experience, that everybody who saves energy makes money on it.
I agree with Amory that actually the key driver has to be bottom line economics. If there's the money to be made, it will work. I mean, the policy is there, and I don't think there's any disagreement between United States and China on the policy. The debate in China has actually moved way beyond the issue of whether you're retarding our development, because you impose these costs on us and these burdens on us. In fact, the debate has become more existential because people refuse to breathe poisonous air. And we're seeing the phenomenon of climate migration in the 21st century sense of people actually leaving and moving from China to other parts of the world.
They're
just
air refugees.
Precisely. They're environmental refugees. They need to breathe. They want their children to be able to breathe. So we see the EP5 program, exploding in the United States for that reason. We see, I spoke to the Swiss ambassador to China, and I was told that we're seeing the beginnings of climate migration to Switzerland from the wealthy, of course, in China for that very reason. And within China itself, the legitimacy of the state, or if you like, the party, is dependent on deliverables being met. And if they can't give deliverables in terms of a living environment, then everybody's kaput. I mean, that's how serious it is. And we see that every day in China. So the issues are highlighted in technicolor over there. The debate has gone well beyond whether we should pay that price for growth, because people are not willing to put up with that.
Absolutely, and this has spawned a major social movement of a kind that we haven't really seen before. I've had 4 trips so far this year. On the 3rd one, I came back with a walking pneumonia because I had not been wearing my HEPA filter mask during 3 days in Shanghai when the air quality was considered very, very good. I believe in February, the mayor of Beijing, we were there at the time, said if the air doesn't get noticeably better by 2017, he's going to cut off his own head. I don't know quite how you do that, but I expect he'd figure out.
There's another vector which is very interesting in China. That's the blogosphere. I mean, for all the talk about the Great Wall of China, you can't get information through. You go to any 17-year-old kid, he can get round the Great Wall in 15 minutes. So everything that's available on the internet is available in China. Now, we have social media in China, which is far bigger than that in the United States or the rest of the world combined. The blogosphere combines a population aggregating 500 million, which is bigger than the population of the United States. Now, the blogosphere, by definition, is uncontrollable, and people say what they want to say. It's very difficult to actually suppress that, or to start using 3 cups to cover 10 peas. You can't do it. And therefore, when people start complaining, and people start complaining about air quality and destruction of the river system, so people start complaining that the Yellow River hasn't reached the sea in 8 years, is not navigable in its lower reaches. It's a very, very big deal. It's a very big deal because it becomes a political issue, and it becomes an issue of legitimacy and survival of the state.
And therefore, the Premier has declared war on pollution and very pointedly used those terms and said, just the way we declared war on poverty. And that's actually gone pretty well for them.
Yeah, I think everybody's pulling on the same side of the rope in China. And as far as the United States is concerned, there's no question this is the world's leader in innovation and technology. And there's no question the United States is the top superpower. Now, if the United States is willing to work hand in glove with China on this strategic partnership in addressing the biggest issue facing mankind, bar none. I don't think there's a more serious issue facing humankind in the early 20th century than what we're facing today on this particular issue. They can join hands, and there's no guarantee we will succeed, but if we do not join hands, I'm pretty confident that the results will be dismal. It's existential for both the United States and for China and the rest of the world.
Absolutely. And now thank you, Daniel. And so to follow up on that, yesterday when President Carter was with us, and we had a little chance to visit across the way, he was talking about his 5th trip coming up to China, and that he meets with Xi Jinping, and he has met with him 4 times before. And he's really coming this time very strong with that message, and that the Chinese people and the political leadership really do see him as a very important advisor for the U.S. So let's dive right into that piece of the conversation that is about solution, and that I think that we all know at some point in the near future we're going to have a global carbon tax. We have got to put a price on carbon. We've got to have some kind of a strategy, and perhaps that's going to come out of the Paris talks next December. Could you both react to that, please?
Well,
Sorry, please, Eamon, go ahead. I was going to say, it's not President Carter's 5th trip to China. He has made close to 100 trips to China. This is his 5th trip to meet Xi Jinping. And he's regarded really as an old friend of China. He's one of the most trusted of world leaders, and he was the one who normalized relations with China in 1979. So it's a very big deal. It's a huge achievement. And for that alone, he deserves the Nobel Peace Prize. I know he got that for something else, for Palestine, for Israel and Egypt. But for the normalization of China, he deserves the Nobel Peace Prize twice over. And he is a trusted advisor and interlocutor. And in terms of actually addressing the problems of the day, there can be no better mediator, I think, than President Carter. I met with him last fall after a trip he made to China with Rosalind coming out to Hong Kong, and we had a very good conversation in which I talked about actually bookending his life with a return visit to China, which is very significant. I think we are ripe to actually harvest some fruits out of that very long relationship. China has always had great affection for the United States because of all Western countries. The United States was singular in not being an imperial power when in the 19th century and the early 20th century there were depredations by so-called imperial powers. The United States actually stepped in and said, no, let's not do that. Let's just start an open door policy. For that, the United States will always be regarded as a very close friend and partner of China.
Chip, you went straight to carbon tax, and I hope we get one in Paris or otherwise, because it would be economically correct, and depending on its level, it may have some effect. I would not, however, jump to the conclusion that it's a sine qua non. You may notice the Reinventing Fire results assumed zero carbon price, and there was still $5 trillion left on the table, and we think that's conservative. It does not count, by the way, side benefits that are enormously more valuable, like better productivity in efficient buildings, better healing in efficient hospitals, faster learning in day-lit schools, more sales in day-lit shops, and so on. So my view of carbon pricing is it would be highly desirable. It is not essential. It is certainly not sufficient, because if you have the right price but don't bust barriers to responding to price, not much happens. We've tried that experiment before. And in the long run, it is not as important as you might suppose, because with so much unbought efficiency that's much cheaper than energy supply, in the long run, a lot of it will get bought, and a carbon market will clear very low. So it's a long-term short in financial terms. So I wouldn't overplay the carbon tax requirement or importance, even though I sure hope we get one.
Well, perhaps I'm referring to it more as a political stick that's going to drive exactly what you're talking about. Somehow we've got to get the world's corporations and the businesses, the biggest carbon emitters, to start to move in that direction.
Any big multinational corporation already operates with carbon pricing in many parts of the world, including parts of the United States, including regions of China that are collectively bigger than the EU, which has currently a collapsed carbon market because they oversupplied it, but they're trying to fix it. And any sensible multinational corp, which is a lot of them, operate with a shadow price on carbon. This is not new, and you don't actually need everybody to agree in order to get the resulting investment behaviors. The investor movement about stranded carbon assets is also very important, but frankly, I think that those hydrocarbons on the balance sheet are less at risk from climate regulation than from straightforward market competition. Those resources are too expensive to exploit and sell competitively in a long-run market, because getting off oil costs only 25 bucks a barrel, and the marginal resources are several times that. They're already out of the money.
Let me add a footnote to what Amory has said. As far as carbon tax and the carbon market is concerned, China is already there. China has introduced a carbon tax. China has been exploring a carbon trading market, looking at the European model. Not totally successfully, but it's a work in progress.
Yep.
And I agree with Amory that a carbon tax, carbon market is not the silver bullet. Nevertheless, it's a step in the right direction, and we should strive for that. Paris is very important, and you will not find China a laggard as far as the Paris negotiations are concerned. The real challenge, I think, as President Carter mentioned, is to get the United States on board on that program.
Because of the geopolitics and the fact that in China they can take decisions at the top and implement them very quickly, and that we have a stagnated Congress, how can China help to literally break that logjam? Is that possible? Is there a way that you both can see?
Well, let me just start by saying that China is nowhere near as efficient as people think it is, because whereas it's a unitary state and it's, as it were, a semi-verticalized command economy still, with marketization permeating through the economy. Nevertheless, because it's so huge, 1.35 billion people, with such a landmass, the individual provinces, counties, cities, autonomous regions actually give two fingers to Beijing. It's very difficult for the writ of Beijing to run in the region. So it's really not that efficient. The United States clearly has its own challenges in terms of congressional gridlock, etc. But in many ways, the two countries are like mirror images of each other. Now, I think the greatest favor, maybe, that China can do for the United States is to move ahead in certain policy innovations, which then wake up the United States to say, hey, what's going on? We can't not be the world's leader. And therefore, that galvanizing of the energy of this country and the enormous goodwill and innovation and ingenuity of the American people would then lead to a renaissance in American thinking on energy. Because I think one of the challenges in the United States is that this country is too well served by natural resources, and therefore the challenge of moving to a green economy is nowhere near as acute as it is in China or in Europe, because Europe has to import all its natural gas from Russia, and that's not good news. And therefore that would give an impetus to European innovation and policy development, as China has to face. So necessity being the mother of invention, as a poor country, China has to, as it were, move quicker and more agilely than the United States. The United States can afford, as it were, to be a bit slow on this. But so I do think these two countries need to work hand in glove.
There's a proverb, 天高皇帝远, heaven is high and the emperor is far away. And it's another respect in which our two countries are very similar despite all the obvious differences. People in much of China don't very much care what goes on in Beijing, much as people in much of the United States, like Western Colorado, may not care terribly much about what mess they get into in Congress. Because so much of our leadership has always been at a state and local level. That's really where a lot of things happen, and that's where a lot of leadership is emerging, just as it is with the mayors and provincial governors and so on in China. Now, every country has different ways of doing things. Here, we have these three poles, if you like, of power and action, namely business, government at various levels, and civil society, and they all interact. And if one of them's not working, you still got two more to work with. In China, it's a little different priority. It's a lot easier if you get the central policy right, and the number of people you need to convince to do that is remarkably small. So that's why I'm really pleased that we've been well received enough at high levels to have a good shot at getting policies adopted in the 13th five-year plan and beyond. that said, the only reason that works is that we are not doing the usual arrogant American model of coming in and telling them what to do. We're viewed as respectful engagement by friends who really want to learn from their experience, which is most remarkable. And they're also very pragmatic. They're all from Zurich. They like to kick the tires and then adopt what works. So our Chinese colleagues have come up with over 100 concrete examples of Chinese success stories in each sector that they can then look at and say, yeah, this works, we're going to make policy about it. But then the implementation is done by a very complex tangle of subnational government entities, party whose doctrine comes out of a series of party schools where we have some interesting conversations, and a lot of good reformers in there, and of course state-owned enterprises and private enterprises and civil society, including the blogosphere. It's just as complicated as getting anything done here. It's just different. And the difference is okay. We have a lot to learn from each other in many respects, but if we approach in the spirit of respectful partnership and mutual learning, I think there is a great deal to be done together. And one of the most important things coming out of China's progress driven by its internal imperatives is that folks who want to do nothing in this country can no longer say it doesn't matter because China won't do it anyway. Quite the contrary, we might get into the interesting situation we used to have in this country where if you wanted to get something done, all you had to do was say the Russians are about to do it. Well, now maybe you say the Chinese are already doing it, and that will get a lot more attention. But the spirit of rivalry has some useful aspects, but I don't want to overplay it. And after all, our economies are all pretty well merged by now. It's not two separate ones.
You're right. Let's drill down on a specific here relating to all of that, and that's about the solar that was developed in the United States and then taken in China, and then a few years ago they were able to reduce the cost such that I believe it came down 75% in 4 years, and that transformed the American market to where today I believe the numbers are around 2.5 minutes a new solar roof comes on every day, every 2.5 minutes. And so that's a function of the economic relationship between and the market forces in the private sector between the two countries. How can that drive this green bridge? You know, that right now, as Les Brown tells us, that constitutes what we know as the death spiral of the utilities. They have to maintain their same infrastructure costs, their same workforce, and yet they're losing market share. And so now even we're finding solar taxes are being talked about and implemented in states, and there's resistance to the net metering because of this radical reduction in cost.
Well, it's a good thing for the world, and unfortunately it's a bit distracted by a sideshow about dumping prices and subsidies, and we don't have entirely clean hands in that area either. I would love to desubsidize the whole energy sector, and I hope I live to see that. It would be very good for efficiency of renewables if we did. But that's actually been bad for the industry because, well, I won't go into that here. And I think most people in the solar industry hope that these trade war messes will go away as common sense reasserts itself. But the issues you raise, which are also partisan political issues in many respects, are, I think, working themselves out through the sorts of efforts I described in the electricity panel yesterday, where both, well, utilities and customers and providers and competitors are all realizing there's mutual value to be created. To take net metering as an example, it breaks at very large scale. It doesn't break at the tiny scale we have now. The distributional effects there are a tiny sideshow, and there's net benefit for all parties involved if you do the math right. Our eLab has published some good papers on distributed benefits that show that they're actually often bigger than the cost of the whole photovoltaic system. But we've also been devising with the Fort Collins utility, the municipal, a very interesting mechanism to overcome that problem, just to use it as an illustration. They have 2 square miles downtown that's going to net zero energy or zero net energy buildings. That's 15% of their service territory. Well, that means zero net revenue if you're selling kilowatt hours, but we've been figuring out together what I call a bidirectional value tariff, where the utility and the customer pay each other the fair value of the services they exchange, and that can scale without breaking. That sort of solution, by the way, is also portable, say, to the Chinese situation, where you have the world's largest utility with, 2 million employees in state grid?
Correct. Yeah.
Incredible achievement. And the lights stay on very nicely in China.
Yeah, I mean, China is the biggest energy market in the world, bar none. And the solar panel phenomenon, I think, is just a microcosm of the sort of old-fashioned trade war issues that we've been looking at in the 90s and early 2000s. And I think it's actually a blip in the development of relations between the two countries, because I think we're not going to see that very much anymore. So that the old issues over whether China is dumping goods on the United States, which obviously benefits the consumer but is very bad for industry, but of course United States industry is actually working in China, and when you look at an iPhone, how much is made in China? Very little, right? In the supply chain.
It's been terrible for firms like Applied Materials
right.
that sold the tools to make those photovoltaics.
Right. I mean, the actual debate will shift because the producer, the manufacturers of these components will not be in China much longer, quite frankly, because of rising costs, because of environmental protection, because of regulatory requirements. It get very expensive to produce in China. So just as textile garments moved from China to Cambodia to Bangladesh to Jordan and so on, we're going to see that shift. And we're going to see that shift very, very shortly, within the next decade. And so that debate, I think, will go away.
Yeah.
The question of whether within a particular energy market you then trade and you get benefits is a very interesting developing phenomenon, not just in the United States, also in China, because people can produce energy and sell it to the grid and make money and become more efficient and basically break the power of utilities. Now, is that such a bad thing? I understand that the sort of destructive dislocations of that, but it's going to happen, I think, globally, as people become more empowered.
Well, utilities have the choice to be, well, there's a lot of ways they can respond to the onslaught of customer and third-party generation. Ostrich is not a good strategy, but many of them are currently deer in the headlights, trying to figure out what to do. They could, of course, buy the competitors and sell their products as their own branded product. They could become system integrators for any technically qualified offerings. They could become financiers. They could finance, install, operate for the customers and provide that as a tariff service. There's a lot of different ways that they could take advantage of the revolution in cheaper, more resilient supply and give customers what they want and make money on it. This does take some regulatory reform, so the panel yesterday focused on how that's going, led by states like New York, and we're right in the thick of that, and I'm thrilled at how that's going. Right. But China has, again, a little different way of doing things. For example, there was a period when a significant fraction of the wind machines were not rapidly enough being connected to the grid, so they'd sit there installed but producing nothing. So a rule was passed which was not yet enforced, but it was held over the heads of state grid. If you do not hook up a wind machine, you have to pay for the power it would have produced anyway, plus 100% penalty. I wish we had rules like that.
Right. I'd like to take the remaining time. We have a little bit less than 5 minutes to go to the audience and engage some questions. I think Senator Wirth has a question there. Could you bring a microphone over, someone? Thanks.
Thank you very much, Chip. I'd like to go back to the discussion of cooperation between the U.S. and China and look particularly at what we're all going to see in late September. You know, about 9 months ago, the Secretary General announced a climate summit, which is going to occur, I think, on the 23rd of September. And the purpose of that was to try to bring leaders of the world together to underscore the importance of the climate issue and try to begin to develop major political momentum leading into Paris at the end of 2015. In response, neither the U.S. nor China said that they were going to have their political leadership go to New York. In fact, when asked directly, the U.S. said that we do not like the idea of this summit, we're not prepared for it, we don't like its timing related to the election of 2014, and please sort of put less of an emphasis on it. But then something started to happen about 2 months ago, and a lot of roundabout discussions in the U.S. government, and the similar sort of thing apparently going on in China. And within a matter of 3 or 4 days, both President Xi and President Obama announced that they were going to go to the summit. So what's going on? You know, it's a very, very interesting development and something that's going to be extremely important for all of us to watch. This will be the first time that these two world leaders, upon whom the world's future depends, are going to be in the same room together, coming to a summit focused on climate change. We are all going to watch that with great, great attention. I wanted to bring that to everybody to watch that, because I think that that may tell us, that may be the most promising single development that we see all year long. It's a political jointness that somehow has emerged out of nowhere. Well, these things don't come out of nowhere. I mean, obviously, a lot of homework was done prior to this joint announcement. Anyway, I'm so glad that the two of you brought that up. I don't know if you have any further reactions to what might come out of this meeting on the 23rd of September. I think the fact that it's happening, you know, is by itself of enormous importance. But thank you both again for a very good discussion.
Well, thank you, Tim, and thank you for thank you for your great work on this. I'll actually be in New York then too, and with some of my senior colleagues. If there's anything you want us to do, let us know. But I want to add one more player to this. Obviously, Europe will be very active, but don't forget India. I was just running around with some colleagues talking to very senior Indian business leaders a few weeks ago, and they are very keen to make India extremely energy efficient. They have a new prime minister who's very pro-renewables. The scene has changed there enough that I think a four-way alignment is starting to take shape, and that could be very exciting.
Great, and since we're out of time, let's have Daniel have the last word.
Well, I'm very glad this last point was brought up by Senator Wirth, because I think all politics are local. And we're getting the local political domestic drivers of politics which lead to a confluence of ideas and a confluence of approaches. Because the environmental catastrophe that we see in China has to be addressed. And it's the local pressure that is building on the leadership in China to make that happen. We see that in this country, people in this room are responsible for some of the pressures being brought on Washington, D.C. to get this done. And we see that clearly in Europe with their energy deficiencies and their energy insecurities, which lead to this type of pressure. So I am cautiously optimistic that we'll see progress happen by September 2015. I'm very glad that point has been brought up.
Great. Well, I want to thank the panelists, and we're going to end on the note that it looks like the green bridge from China to the U.S. That goes both ways is happening, and perhaps it's going to happen in earnest and on the 23rd in New York. So thank you very much, gentlemen.